History of role-playing games in 101 objects, and it's time for another sidebar. Tangent 4, the ambush at Sheridan Springs. Before we start, I'm completely indebted for this section to the excellent RPG historian Jon Peterson. Most of what I've got to say here is taken essentially from his article published in medium.com. You can find the link to the full and really quite lengthy and extremely well researched article down below. I recommend you read it, but you can listen to me first. This is all about how Gary Gygax lost control of TSR. And essentially we go to October the 22nd, 1985. Sheridan Springs in Lake Geneva is the corporate headquarters of TSR, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And there is a board meeting. The board of TSR at the time, let's see, there was Gary Gygax, there was Kevin Bloom and Brian Bloom, although they'd stepped away from being executive directors, and there were some non-executive directors, and then there was the company secretary whose name is Gary. The first order of business at the board meeting, apparently a controversial order of business, Gary Gygax essentially wanted income to be assigned to the author of D&D rulebook supplements and adventures, not the company, which of course is particularly relevant for him because he wrote a lot of stuff. Not that surprisingly, his fellow directors didn't think this was such a good idea. Essentially, I think probably they saw it as Gary Gygax trying to take away income that should belong to the company and give it to himself. So apparently Gary Gygax jokingly said, well, maybe I should resign then, you can just pay me as a freelancer. And somebody in the board meeting said, okay. And at this point you can imagine Gary Gygax thinking, what's going on here? What have I missed? So beginning to get an inkling that there's something up, Gygax asks the company secretary if there have been any changes in shareholdings. Now, you need to consider what the shareholdings are in TSR at this point. It used to be the case that nobody had a majority shareholding in TSR. The main shareholders were Gary Gygax, Brian Bloom, he'd been in close to the beginning, and Kevin Bloom, who was Brian's younger brother, who got the shares of their father, who put investment into TSR very early on. Over the years, other employees of TSR had acquired small shareholdings through sort of company share ownership schemes. One of those, incidentally, was Dave Arneson. And a few other people had got small shareholdings, but the three main shareholders for most of TSR's history up until this point were Gygax and different members of the Bloom family. Over the years, Gary Gygax had exercised a number of share options and had actually built up his shareholding, so that by October 1985, he didn't quite have a majority shareholding, but he sort of did, because one of those small other shareholders was Ernie Gygax, Gary's son. And if you added the two Gygax family member shares together, it came to just over 50%. So Gary had essentially a controlling share in TSR. Or so he thought. So he asked the company secretary at the board meeting, have there been any changes in shares? The company secretary looks sheepish at this point and says, Lorraine Williams has exercised her option for an additional X shares. I forget how many it was exactly, but it was a small amount. Lorraine Williams, incidentally, was a sort of vice president brackets business or some sort of anomalous title like that. She was somebody that Gary had met when he was out in Hollywood trying to sort film rights out. He dealt a lot with her brother, who was a guy called Flint Dill, who was a writer. Flint had introduced Gary to Lorraine, who wasn't a gamer, wasn't necessarily anybody interested in science fiction or fantasy, but was somebody with apparently the sound business head. And she'd come back and essentially she'd worked in a senior capacity at TSR. Wasn't necessarily impressed by the way TSR was run as a business, which in the 80s seems to have been a bit vague. They were doing well, don't get me wrong, but not necessarily because of any great business expertise. One thing in particular, they seem to, at various points, seem to have three people serving as a sort of joint president. The two Blooms and Gygax, all of them were president, and so all decisions that were made by the president had to be a unanimous decision of the three, and that was a bit awkward. So Lorraine Williams essentially comes to work for TSR as a sort of like a business manager, vice president, I think it was the title. And when Gygax is away, she works as president. And in fact, by this time, the two Bloom brothers have stepped away from being executive directors and are no longer actually working for TSR. They just own shares. In fact, they'd tried to sell the shares back to the company. TSR and Gygax wanted the company to buy the Bloom shareholdings back from them in a share buyback. To do that, they needed to raise capital from the banks. It was a difficult time to get bank lending in the US, and the banks essentially said no, so they couldn't do it. And Gary didn't have the money to buy them out personally, etc., etc. But the two Blooms had stepped away from being actively involved in the business by this point. Earlier in '85, but they didn't want to sort of essentially they wanted to stay as directors because they had a big investment in the company, which seems fair enough. So, but they weren't acting as two heads of this three-headed president. And when Gygax wasn't around, for example, when he was out west, Lorraine Williams essentially was acting president. But anyway, that Lorraine Williams activating her share option wouldn't really change Gary Gygax's status as majority shareholder, effective majority shareholder. So he asks the question again of the company secretary, have there been any other changes in shareholdings? The company secretary looks really sheepish at this point, really, really sheepish. And he says, yes, Brian Bloom has exercised share options of a lot of shares. Gygax over the years had increased his shareholding by exercising his options, his share options. Brian Bloom never had, so he still had these share options, and he exercised them now. And with those shares in play, it meant that Gary Gygax was no longer the majority shareholder. It wasn't clear to Gygax at this point in the meeting who was the majority shareholder, though, because that's where it gets interesting. So there is a resolution in the board meeting to approve this share option, which obviously is passed. And then somebody else puts forward a resolution that Gary Gygax be replaced as president of TSR by Lorraine Williams, which Gygax is just completely stunned by. He can't understand why Lorraine Williams. She's not a gamer. She's got a business head, but she's absolutely not a gamer. She's only been with the company 6 months. What he doesn't realise is that Brian Bloom has exercised all those shares, and both him and Kevin Bloom have then sold their shares to Lorraine Williams. And what that means is that Lorraine Williams is now the majority shareholder of TSR. The resolution is passed, and Lorraine Williams becomes president of TSR, and Gary Gygax is not. And essentially, that is pretty much the end of Gary Gygax at TSR. He was ambushed. That's why Jon Peterson calls it the ambush at Sheridan Springs. He was ambushed. Partly, I suppose, his own fault for not sort of remembering those share options that the Blooms had. But yeah, TSR essentially became somebody else's company, and that somebody was Lorraine Williams. An interesting person in a way. If you see sort of accounts by TSR people of the time, you will see different points of view about her. You'll see some TSR staffers at the time who genuinely hated her and thought she ruined the company. And you'll see some TSR staffers at the time said, actually, she did a lot of good things. She kept the company going for a lot longer than it probably would have done otherwise. It's very difficult to find a photograph of her. This is the best one I could find. This is what Lorraine Williams looked like. This is actually taken from the TSR's Silver Anniversary box set. which is a really nice rare collectible if you've got one. It's about the only place I could find one. And here we've got object. I've included this as object 44. Object 43 in our 101 objects. This is the share certificate that records Lorraine Williams's new large majority shareholding. She's also the reason why TSR goes on to produce a Buck Rogers role-playing game, because, and this explains why she got the money from to make the investment and buy all those shares. She was the granddaughter of the guy who created Buck Rogers, or held the rights. So there it is. Gary Gygax was out at TSR. And I think you'll sometimes see the phrase old school Dungeons and Dragons. And a lot of discussion online about what constitutes old school and new school Dungeons and Dragons. I think actually I'd probably go with the, it's a style of play as much as anything. But if you wanted to put a particular date and time of when we move from old school to new school, you could make it October the 22nd, 1985, when Gary Gygax is pushed out of TSR and Lorraine Williams takes over. In the next chapter, we'll look at one of the big effects of Lorraine Williams' time at TSR, which is second edition comes in, which was something that Gygax had been working on, but now gets obviously taken over by the people, and the proliferation of second edition AD&D campaign settings. So that's next time. That's chapter 6, second edition. We'll see you then.